Thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Life Support. If you enjoy the content, we would ask that you like it, hit subscribe, and share it with your friends. Hey, so glad you're with us today on Life Support. And what we do here is we tell stories. We talk about how Jesus overcomes difficulties and trials and trauma so that we can have a deeper relationship with Him. And I've got a very special guest with us today who I've known for quite some time. We've had a lot of fun together. At least I've had fun with Mark. I'm not sure that he would agree with that, but his name is Mark Clark, and he is an author and a pastor. He pastors Village Church in Canada, one of the, if not the largest church in Canada. And Mark, it's so good to talk with you. And you're in Canada right now, right?
I am in Canada and still alive.
Yeah, it's been pretty rough up there, hasn't it?
It has been, it's been weird. There's certain parts of Canada are worse than others. Where I am, British Columbia, on the left coast, west coast out here, it's okay. It's been pretty, restaurants have been open, blah blah. But the closer you move to Toronto and those kind of places, it's pretty closed down. So yeah, it's we're coping through like everybody, trying to do our best. But yes, the audience. I mean, don't downplay. Paul, you were my boss for many years, and you took a huge risk with me and planted a church, even though you and I were pastoring a church that you could probably fit 4 of them in the auditorium where we were at the time. And you still took a risk and saw a calling in my life and sent me out with a group of people, even though the church wasn't all that excited about it, and sent me out. And it's been awesome. God's been in it ever since. So you were fantastic to me. And thank you for that.
Oh, that's really nice, Mark. Thank you. And that was right on cue. So thanks for reading that liner I gave you. I really appreciate that.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were just trying to downplay. And
no. So listen, you have, I really want to talk about you and how God has really worked in your life. And you're anointed to do what you're doing, but you grew up in the Toronto area, and it didn't always look like that, did it? I mean, you didn't have an easy background. Talk a little bit about where you came from and how that was for you.
Yeah, so I grew up in a non-Christian home, and my dad was a bit of a drinker. My early memories of him are just yelling at football games and smoking his pipe and drinking. And my mom and him didn't have the greatest relationship. They ended up getting divorced when I was about 8 or 9. And at that time I developed Tourette's syndrome and obsessive compulsive disorder. And the doctors basically say it was probably because of the trauma of going through the divorce of my parents. It's just like one day, 7, 8 years old, my dad walks up, he's like, I'm out and we're getting divorced. And he left, and, never saw him again for years. And I developed these tics and these habits where I would randomly swear at people, like sitting at the bus stop, I'd be like, F, or whatever. I just like, and like make noises, and facial tics, which I still have. And all these random weird, I'd pick up habits too. I'd see somebody do something, and I just grab it and I'd start doing it. And then that grew into obsessive compulsive disorder, where I would have to do certain things in order for bad things not to happen. So I'd be thinking about, like, someone would say like the word AIDS or something in a room, and I'd have to like hit the table a certain amount of times so that you wouldn't get AIDS, or I would, whatever. It was like this, and we'd get on a plane and I'd smack a post, and then I'd walk, and then I'd realize I didn't smack the post 3 times. So I'd have to walk all the way back and smack it so the plane didn't go down. And this became like, by the time I was, 15, 16, I had this habit where I would go down on my knees. I would bang my knees on the ground and flip my hat in the air. And I was a smoker, so I'd always be outside. And so here I am, middle of the winter, growing up in Toronto, snow, a foot deep, and I'm banging down on my knees. In high school, my jeans had these big wet spots. And I'd be walking around with these wet spots, and it's like, what is wrong with this guy? And so, yeah, it wasn't easy, going through junior high and senior high, having these weird, be sitting in a room, everyone's doing a math exam, and the room's dead quiet and there's 200 people in the gymnasium and I'm, making noises because I don't want to make a noise. And of course, that's what you do. So it was a weird upbringing.
But that's a lot of pressure on a young guy to try to conform like that and to try to in a sense control your behavior. I mean, that had to be stressful and difficult.
Yeah, it totally was. And there was kind of two sides of me. There was the one side that kind of didn't care. I think God probably wired some self-defense mechanism into me that was like, whatever, it's me. And so for some reason, I still had friends. I had friends on all sides. I hung out with the cool guys, the geeks, the athletes, the actors. I was kind of all over the map in high school and kind of made my way through that. People just kind of, I don't know, accepted my weird, I have no idea actually what anyone was thinking. But then a piece of me, you realize that in times of pressure and stress, it got worse. So even to the point where, we both have theology degrees. So I'd be doing Greek, which was like the hardest thing other than quitting smoking, doing Greek for 3 years is probably the hardest thing I ever did in my life. And it was like those exams would come up and I could just feel my tics, just getting worse and worse and worse. Or even, Paul, when we were planting Village, there was this season where it was so much stress and pressure that like I was doing these weird tics where I would like kiss the air, and it was just like, why does anyone just go, buddy, get out? Like, I can't deal with. So we'd be sitting at, Tim Hortons or whatever, eating chili, and I'd be kissing the air trying to plan this church. And so somehow, I don't know if God built something into me early, knowing this would happen or whatever went down, but somehow I kind of survived the social pressure of it. But it was a weird world to navigate.
So when did God then reach in spiritually and grab hold of you? Because given that background, a lot of us would just write that kid off. I mean, you're not in a Christian home. Your dad's left. You've got this disability you're struggling with. When did God reach in and grab a hold of you?
So my grandfather, who is still alive, 99 years old.
Wow.
Crazy. And he was the Christian in my family. He used to, of course, pray for us. And when my parents got divorced, he sent us to a Christian camp as kids. And so that's where I heard about Jesus for the first time and accepted Christ. But then I didn't really do anything with it. I just kind of, said the summer camp prayer and moved on with my life. And would kind of go back there and see counselors and kids every year. And it kind of set a bit of a moral compass in my life. And then when I was about 18, I was in, grade 11 or 12. And I was in woodworking class and I met this guy named Chris, and his whole life had been changed by Jesus. And he told me, he's like, you need to believe in Jesus. And we started studying the Gospels together. And he really just like told me the gospel. I accepted Christ. And then Paul, there's no way to explain. It was the supernatural Holy Spirit, like, the hound of heaven, right? Hunted me down, saved me, sealed me. And it was like something ignited. And I was just like, you couldn't have a conversation with me without us talking about Jesus. And I would go around my town, smoking a pack of cigarettes, reading the Bible, telling everybody I saw about Jesus, walking up to people on their doorsteps, praying for them at 2 a.m, baptizing people in Lake Ontario 2 years before I was ever baptized because I hadn't even been to a church yet. I was just like, I was like John the Baptist at Ajax.
That's cool.
I'm just running around like, but it was like the Bible. It's like, Augustine says the Bible is the face of God for us now. And that's literally where I met God. It's like the word behind the word, and I just, something about the Bible. It was like, I'd read it every day and it would calm me and it would focus me. And I would tell people about it. So anyway, so that's what started. And all my friends that I used to smoke dope with and steal out of cars and do all that stuff, 3 weeks later, I'm telling them about Jesus, defending Christianity to them and so this kind of, apologetic side of me, this kind of thing, it probably came from the years of everyone in my social world was non-Christian. I hadn't been to a church yet. So I had to figure out on my feet how to defend Christianity against 30 of my friends in a garage, half of whom were completely high or hammered. So that was kind of where that stuff was born. But yeah, God got a hold of me, 17, 18 years old and never let me go and just said, okay. And my identity became then in Christ, and all this stuff didn't matter. It was like, I am who I am. Let's go.
Yeah. And that really causes me to question this whole discipleship model we have in churches, where you give your life to Christ, you have to go through a period of growth, and then you reproduce. And I think what we're missing is that moment of conversion is when somebody is ready to reproduce like crazy, because they don't have those inhibitions. They haven't learned how not to do it yet. I mean, there you are in garages, talking to people, and God's using you in a way that a quote unquote mature Christian probably would get scared off from.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Something I hadn't really connected the dots with, but you're right. It's like we always talked about in the church planting days. New people bring new people, and it's like you staring out at the same guy who's been sitting in the same chair for 10 years. He ain't bringing a friend, bro. No matter, I don't care if you get up there in your unicycle and entertain them. He ain't bringing a friend. It's the new guy who shows up who's going to bring his friend. And so in the same way, you're right. New faith, just like the excitement of it, the passion of it. You got to set these people free before they're ready. And what's funny about that is there's a youth pastor in my life who totally saw that and walked up to me. So I walked into church finally when I was 19, saw some pretty girls and decided to stay. And
married a pretty girl at some point.
I married a pretty girl who was up there in the worship team. And I'm like, okay, I like church. This is great. And I was literally still smoking every day before church. I would go in the back of the church and I would smoke. And there was this window there before the service, I would smoke. And finally, after about 2 months, a guy walked up to me on the worship team. He said, listen, that window is the senior pastor's office. And every Sunday, the whole worship team's in there praying and you're smoking in the back. Like we're literally watching you. It's like, oh. So anyway, the youth pastor walks up to me and he says, I want you to preach a sermon. And I'm like, buddy, I've been in church for 6 months. Like, what are you talking about? And he said, I want you to preach at the youth group. And so he said, preach any passage you want. So I took Matthew 23 and just screamed at all these church kids about being religious. You whitewashed tombs, and I'm having a cigarette outside before I go in. Like and Andy Stanley talks about this too. Put people in leadership who may not be ready. And he doesn't mean by that, like character wise. It's like they're not, like you're saying, they're not polished. They're not ready in the way that we think they are, but they're the ones who can do awesome stuff. So,
yeah, and those are the people that actually have that passion that's still burning in them that rubs off on other people. It's not really about having the right tools all of the time. It's about passion. People react to passion. They react to when it's bleeding out of you. They can't help but follow.
Passion covers over a multitude of incompetencies.
Yeah, no, that's 100% right. All right, so here you are now. You're at this church. You're a new believer. You're a little rough around the edges. When did God say, "Hey, Mark, I think this ministry thing might be for you"?
So yeah, I was going to go into the film industry and loved that. I was doing that since I was a kid. Writing, filming, editing. Loved that world. And I was going to college for it. I was in my first year, already signed up, already taking classes, and I went on a trip. And there was a girlfriend of mine, not dating, but just a girlfriend of mine, and we went to her house, and we were all hanging out and staying over there for the weekend. And her dad and I got into a conversation, and we were sitting in a room, and he just said, "I feel like God's telling me something about you." And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "I think ministry is what you need to go into. I'm just sensing you have this leadership ability, this knowledge gift, this teaching, preaching gift that you need to lead people." And I was like, yeah, no, not a thing. And he's like, "But you're an evangelist. And I think this needs to be part of what you do, for like a more formal version of this in ministry." And I was like, yeah, that's not a thing. 2 weeks later, went up to my buddy's cabin, 4 guys. All 3 of them around the campfire looked at me and said, "God's been telling us something about you. He's telling us you need to quit college and go into ministry." And I'm like, "What?" And then it happened a 3rd time. And by the time I was sitting at I work at Michael's Arts and Crafts store at the time. And I was sitting there putting googly eyes away or whatever. And for $6.25 an hour. And I felt literally this presence break me. And I'm not a big crier. I started to cry in Michael's. No one had said anything to me. I started to cry because there was such a palpable sense of a call. I called Erin up and she came on my break and we prayed, and it was like, this is what you need to do. You need to go into ministry. And so, growing up in a home without church life, I'm like, they're not going to buy this. So I went and got all the brochures and I did a big pitch to my parents, and they said, you can do this for 1 year. But if it doesn't go well, you're going back to normal college, get your 2-year degree and get on with it. And, 3 weeks in, they could just see a passion, a spark. I leaned in, and kind of the rest is history.
Yeah. This is Mark Clark. He's a pastor at Village Church in Canada. And we're just kind of exploring his background. And, at that moment, you knew that ministry was there, but you had no training. You had no tools, really. I mean, so what's next? How did you pursue that?
Yeah, I mean, I started doing the school, and I loved education. Then I kept in the youth group, and I kept preaching and teaching in the youth group. And the youth pastor was just giving me opportunities. And then they let me on like youth day at the church. I don't know if you do those where the youth get up and slam away on the drums and no one knows what's happening. They would let me preach, hey, give the guy a sermon. And, of course I'd practice that sermon for 4 months. The thing was down pat, whereas now you and I, we got to pump these things out every week. So, so anyway, I get up there and obviously everyone's like, oh my God, this is great, and so that just started to really fuel, a passion to preach and teach. And then, so that's what I was going to do. And then my second year of college, I had some professors come up to me and say, actually, if you want to know the biggest way to impact youth, we think you're actually supposed to become more of a professor. And they started giving me opportunities to be a teaching assistant, to do lectures at the school, marking papers. It's my second year. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm 20 years old. I'm not going to be a professor. And this one teacher, Steve Thompson, just leaned into me. And it was cut to the montage of him and I at 6:30 in the morning in his office trying to figure the Apostle Paul out, and then 10 at night at Swiss Chalet trying to exegete, whatever. It was great. 4 years this guy poured into me and my closest friend at the time, and ignited in me a passion for scholarship, which is why I ended up moving out to British Columbia. It was to go to school out here, do a master's degree, and then move overseas and do a PhD so I could become a professor. Long story short, I'm out here, and 2007 comes around and God says, I don't want you to do a PhD, get your master's degree, but I want you to plant a church. And I was like, what? Why would I start a church? I don't get it. It's not going to work. And then you came into my life 6 months later, and you were sitting you were being interviewed for the job. And you're sitting in a room full of people that you don't know. It's 30 of us in a room. And I haven't told anybody about this secret, call on my life to go plant a church. And you just said, someone said, what would you do if you came to this church? And he said, well, because I think you'd come up and heard me preach secretly or something in your candidating process. And you just said, well, why wouldn't we? We're a great position to plant churches. Why wouldn't we plant the church with that guy? And you just pointed at me across the room, and the whole room looked at me, and I was like, oh, this guy's been reading my mail. What's happening? And clearly the Spirit was doing something in your life. And anyway, you came on and made that happen. And yeah, it was kind of crazy.
But you had this Tourette's thing. And I remember having a conversation with you, and I remember that you looked at me and said something like, but Paul, these rich white people are not going to listen to me because I have this thing. And I said, no, that's what makes you you. That's why they're going to listen to you. And isn't it true that God uses people who are quote unquote a little off the grid or a little unusual, but those are the people that capture people, right? And he used that in your life in a huge way.
Yeah, my fear when we were planting out here was I did the demographic study and I met all these people and I did a few sermons, and they're pulling up in their perfect cars and their perfect homes and their perfect lives. And because it's an area that's a little more well-to-do that we were planting in. And I was like, I'm up there twicking my face around, making weird noises. This is not going to work, Paul. And we're sitting there for coffee or lunch. And you said, no, I think it will work. And then you said, because you're going to give them permission. And what you meant by that was permission, because behind all the facade, their life is a mess. And when they look at you tweaking around and messing around, making noises up there, they're going to follow you because it's 1 Corinthians 1, right? God woos the world through foolishness. The Greek word moronic, God is glorified through the morons. And it's like, that's what he'll do. And you're going to give these perfect people permission to be broken, to walk with a limp, because all of them are anyway. And that is literally what happened. People just started showing up and being like, finally, a church, a leader who doesn't pretend they're perfect. And I learned that from you, because the leaders that I had served under to that point, they had put on this facade of perfection. And I think, to be honest, one of the big roles that I'll just be, indebted to you forever that you played in my life is you showed up and you didn't pretend to be perfect. There was a brokenness about your life that you actually led from. It wasn't like, oh, there's something in my past that's kind of, bad. But anyway, I'll just, now I'm a leader and I'm strong and everyone should trust me. It was like, you know what? Some days on Tuesdays, I hate all of you and I don't want to be in this meeting, or whatever. Like, you would never actually say that, but it's like,
right.
But you gave me permission in that moment, because every leader I had sat under played the perfect role with the perfect family. And that was a huge amount of pressure. And to sort of serve under a leader that was like, you know what? I'm not perfect. There are meetings I don't want to be in, and my life is what it is. And I am who I am. And I'm not going to pretend to be somebody else. Gave me a huge amount of freedom. To this day, I think about that as like, oh, leaders don't have to pretend to be perfect. And so that's what began to happen in the church. People started to show up and kind of be drawn to the authenticity. I forget who it was, Mark Batterson. I said authenticity is like the new currency in leadership. There's kind of like, don't be fake with me. And people started to meet Jesus, and they started connecting. All these perfect people started connecting to the message of imperfection, because it was about the gospel now. It's Jesus. The Father declares down on Jesus, "You are my beloved Son," and then he does his ministry from that place. He doesn't say it at the end. It's not like Jesus goes and heals everybody, raises a bunch of dead people, does these great sermons, gets to the cross, and then God goes, "You are my beloved Son because of all that stuff you did. Now you can go to the cross. You really performed well." It's like right at the beginning, he says, "Here's your identity," and then perform from there.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I think we just scratched the surface. So next time we need to pick the story up. But tell me about the latest book, Mark. You're an author. You've written some really great stuff, and a lot of it comes out of that apologetic, that bent that you have. Tell me about that book.
Yeah. So a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Problem of God, and it was answering kind of the top 10 skeptical questions that people have against Christianity: hypocrisy, science, hell, that kind of stuff. And then, and it did really well, and people were like, we want more. So I wrote a book called The Problem of Jesus. It just came out in February, and it's basically everything I've got on Jesus for the last 20 years, about defending, was Jesus a historical person? How do the gospels work? Are miracles a thing? How do the parables work? Loving God. Was Jesus the only way? The death, the resurrection, all of that, all in one book. So it came out in February, and I'm getting crazy great stories about people using it to reach their friends. So it's great.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for being here, my friend. I appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me, sir. Thanks for what you're doing.